Me and my two friends planned to go on a getaway for the summer. Nothing too crazy, but maybe an Airbnb or a cabin somewhere far in the city. We were on summer break and had nothing better else to do. We packed our bags and ordered an Uber to take us there. My friend Max was the one in charge of choosing the place to stay, so we didn't know what to expect. Once we got there and settled down, everything seemed good. It was a beautiful studio home with 2 bedrooms and a hot tub. Max went to turn on the hot tub whilst we unpacked for the weekend. I look out the window from my room and saw a man standing outside, standing still checking out the home. I couldn't see who it was as it was dark, but it was clear someone was faced towards the Airbnb. I told my other friend Dre to come take a look. He thought it would be funny to bang on the window to get his attention. As much as I thought it would be funny, I tried to stop him, but he was already banging on the window and making weird help me faces. The stranger looked up and Dre quickly ducked. I laughed as this was such an immature thing to do, but somewhat funny. 5 minutes had passed, and out of curiosity I looked back out the window, and the same guy was there just staring up at our window, completely hidden by the darkness but visible. Strange, I muttered to myself before being called to the hot tub. I undressed and jumped in. Everything was going well. The air was filled with laughter whilst we told old stories to each other. About an hour goes by before we hear faint footsteps. We didn't know where it was coming from. We figured it was nothing and continued our conversation. Until we heard it again, this time closer. We looked around and saw no one. It was pitch black and late, around 11 p.m. Anyone who would be out at this time was rare. I forgot to mention that the Airbnb was in the forest, so it was deserted and surrounded by huge trees. After about a minute of silence, we heard it again. This time it was even closer, and it was evident that someone or something was near the home. This was enough for us to decide to go back inside, as the whole thing was just creepy. We went inside and dried up. I was in the living room deciding on a movie to watch with the boys, until I heard a tap on the window behind me next to the front door. I quickly turned my head towards to the window and saw no one. "Is this a prank?" I said to myself. I was alone downstairs and heard it again. This time I got up and went to the window to see what it was. In the distance, I saw a man with a bag over his head, with only the eyes and mouth cut out. I was horrified and fell back on my hands. I closed the window blinds and ran up to the boys, telling them what I had just encountered. They were all amused, mocking me. I was pissed. I tried explaining it the best I could. No use. They thought I was pranking them or something. After 20 minutes, I calmed down and we all watched a movie. Halfway into the movie, Dre paused it and hushed us. We heard the back door being fiddled with. "Is that the back door?" I whispered. Dre's eyes widened and his face became pale. "I forgot to lock it," he whispered loudly. The rest of us looked at each other, not knowing what to do. My heart sank. I knew it was that same guy I saw earlier. Max said he had a gun by the front door, but he would be seen by the intruder. 2 minutes later, the back door had been unlocked and the door creaked opened. Footsteps coming from the kitchen, which was the first thing you'll enter upon arrival. Max crouched down, and without making a noise, he crawled towards the front door. We watched while being on standby in case anything were to happen. Dry was on call to the police, trying to be as quiet as he could. The man must have heard us because he started walking towards the living room. His footsteps were heavy, almost stomping his way over. His breaths were loud and heavy, and we heard clinks like something metal he was holding. Who knew what this guy could have carried? We all started to prepare for fight or flight. Max got a hold of the gun from the box, and just before the man entered the living room, Max shot the gun without thinking towards the intruder's direction. This caused the man to run out the back door so fast into the woods before we could comprehend what had just happened. Before he ran out, he dropped something, what I assumed to be the metal thing he was holding before. Max went up towards the object as we did too. We all shared a look of horror as we realized it was an axe that he dropped. An axe with dried blood piled on it, just left on the floor of the home. Dre went to lock the back door and we could not find any traces of fresh blood, meaning Max must have missed his shot. The police came and took us in for questioning. They gathered up all the evidence and statements and said they would let us know if they had any updates. We all left the next day, returning to our homes. 5 years later, we all reunited for a catch-up. We spoke and laughed over a few beer cans, until the story of that summer getaway came up. We all became silent. It still shook us up till this day. We believe that the guy was never found, as the police never contacted us. And after that day, we never went to that Airbnb ever again. And we also knew never to leave Max in charge of choosing the location again. I am an 18-year-old female who lives with my single mom. My dad and her got divorced when I was 12. Every now and then I go visit my dad and even stay with him. Side note, my dad lives about an hour away in a hidden place. I mean really hidden. You have to drive through a narrow forest in order to get there. He has 2 neighbors beside his home. One of the neighbors was a grown middle-aged man, pushing 40, let's call him John. Whenever I would go up to my dad's house, John would always stare me down whenever I arrived, left or needed to step out for something. I would see him peeking through his windows with a weird devilish grin across his face. Honestly, the whole thing was creepy. I mentioned it to my dad and he told me not to take it to heart. His wife left him and took his children with her about a year ago. I didn't care, to be honest. I just wanted him to stop being creepy. Fast forward, my dad called me asking if I was coming up. Why not, I said. I was free. So on Friday I packed my stuff and he picked me up. Once we arrived, I saw John watering his dead plants outside. My dad greeted him and went inside. While I was unloading my bags from the boot, John crept up behind me and said with a deep, raspy voice, "Need help, darling?" "No thanks, I'm fine," I replied. His breath stank of something rotten. I could smell it even though he was an inch away. I met his eyes once and suddenly felt bad energy, an energy I have never felt before. He backed off and I went inside, locking the door behind me. My dad left and wouldn't be home until later, so I just sat on FaceTime to my friend. It was raining heavy, and I realized that I hadn't bought my charger, and my dad has a Samsung, not an Apple. I called him to see when he would be back. Not for another few hours. What was I going to do? Looking back at it, I was foolish to do this. But I was desperate, and home alone for a few hours without my phone was torture. I sighed as I wore my jacket and went to my neighbors, not John's. The second neighbor was a couple, and I knew they would have a charger. I knocked and rang their doorbell. Nothing. No one answered. "They're not home, love," said John. I jumped and looked back in surprise. He was standing about a feet away from me, in the rain with no jacket, just his shirt and joggers. "Need help with something?" I know I should have just left it, but I was desperate. Bluntly, I asked, "Is it possible you have an Apple charger that I can borrow?" He chuckled and said he did, but he would have to get it from his room. He told me to come inside and wait since it was pouring. I declined, but he insisted, "You're my best mate's daughter. No way I'm leaving you out in the rain." It was only a few seconds, I thought. No point waiting at my dad's. I reluctantly agreed and came inside. He went upstairs to fetch the charger. His house reeked of expired meat, beer cans dashed around the room, dirty laundry scattered and cobwebs all over the corners of the walls. I tried to hold my breath while I waited. 3 minutes had passed. He was still upstairs. 5 minutes, and I was still waiting. I called to him saying, "Is everything okay?" No response. I was getting impatient and went upstairs, quietly so he wouldn't hear me. His bedroom door was open and he wasn't inside. Then there was the door to his basement. It was wide open and dimly lit. Before I could enter it, I felt a push from behind me, causing me to fall to my knees. I looked back and saw John with bloodshot eyes, a blade in his hand, holding it up at me. I screamed, and as he approached, with all my might, I kicked him in the balls. It was the only thing I could think of in that moment of time. I kicked him, and he let out a groan and fell to the floor. Without thinking, I quickly got up and ran out the basement, out the front door, and back to my dad's house. I locked all the doors and windows. I was panicking, and my breaths were rapid. My stomach felt like it was about to puke. With my remaining percentage, I called 911 and told them just in time the situation before my phone died. I'm sure they were on their way. All I could do was sit and wait. 20 minutes later, they arrived and did a full sweep of his house, and he was nowhere to be found. He had ran away. My dad returned home after hearing the news and hugged me so tight, constantly apologizing. The police did an investigation after I described to them what he looked like. Turns out, he was a wanted criminal for things that are too sick to mention, and was hiding out next door to my dad's for about a few months. The sob story he told my dad was fake, just to manipulate him into not being suspicious. My dad has now moved houses, and I rarely see him as much. I don't stay around his house anymore, and I try to keep myself distracted to avoid thinking of that night. I will never know if he has been found.